Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in, and welcome to our talk this afternoon. It's one of a series of fortnightly discussions from 42 Bedford Row about many aspects of family law, which we hope you'll find interesting and helpful. The topic of tonight's talk concerns the tricky issue of pensions on divorce, never straightforward at the best of times, but made more fraught in the mind of the practitioner since the pandemic. And we're going to be looking at some of the difficulties posed by recent events, and also look at some recently decided cases which give some guidance as to how the courts are interpreting and applying the Pensions Advisory Group report, which was published a year ago. To discuss these issues, we have our own James Sharp, barrister specialising in family law, including financial remedies work. And we're also really lucky to have with us this afternoon Nigel Sloan, actuary and pensions expert. He's also the chairman of the International Association of Consulting Actuaries. And I know that many of you will have had direct experience of his expert input into divorce cases. Before I hand over to you, James, let me just remind everyone that after their talk, which will last about 20 minutes, there will be some time for questions. So if any of you have any, please type them into the Q&A box in the sidebar, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So over to you, James.
Thank you, Jeremy. So Nigel and I talked about pensions earlier this week, and this is what we discussed. Hello, Nigel. Well, I think my first question, and the question that everyone will be thinking, is how has COVID-19 changed things?
Okay, well, first, for the benefit of you all, there'll be a huge increase in the number of divorces. The experience of lockdown has meant that all of you are in the right place at the right time. The experience triggered by the COVID-19 virus has made seminal long-term and lasting changes to expectations, securities, value, and ways of working, which may never be reversed. These affect everything, including pensions. In these circumstances, the practical utility of pension assets has to be reassessed as never before by those who have them, those who acquire them on divorce, and their advisors. The inherent chaos in human experience has increased. People can't rely as hitherto on sources of income to supply needs when they want. They may be out of a job for periods at different points in life and require cash flow because of illness, when work has dried up, the business in their work sector has fallen, or when their additional sources of income also from a variety of investments, interest, dividends and rents have also declined as a result of the pandemic. Therefore, the time when and the extent to which one needs to draw on resources has changed correspondingly. From now on, no job can be assumed to be certain. No employer other than government can be assumed to be immortal. Promises from an employer have to be reassessed in this light. As a result of poorer trading conditions, the sustained drop in interest rates, which now makes the cost of providing a guarantee of pensions so much higher, the general fall in asset levels and in reductions in interest and rental and dividend yields, guaranteed pension promises given previously by employers in the private sector are even more expensive to deliver. It must be accepted that some employers won't be able to honour commitments, and those that can will do so at the expense of their future investments, current employees and shareholders. Funding past liabilities may become the principal focus of management. Companies like Shell and BT have been forced to cut dividends in order to fund pre-existing pension commitments. And in many, many more cases, historic pension promises can't be relied on fully. The aftermath of COVID-19 and lockdown have also stimulated new practical difficulties. Where people are working remotely, it is less easy to obtain information on time. This isn't a huge problem where underlying data relates to stock exchange listing assets. Where, however, information needs to be obtained from a private sector defined benefit scheme, from an insurance office or a large SIP provider, long delays may be experienced, and the information provided can become out of date before it's even received. Somebody once said it's more difficult to obtain information from an insurance office than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Further, for some time to come, there will be increased volatility in the investment markets, and henceforth, valuations produced at one moment in time may be less reliable an asset for long-term provision or a basis for division. Immediately following the onset of COVID-19 in the West, there was a general drop in asset values worldwide. Since then, there's been considerable recovery, but values have not yet generally resumed former levels. In some sectors, there's been a permanent change. The experience of remote working and internet buying has caused a general reassessment of the need to trade from shops and how much office space firms actually need to conduct their business. Property values and rents have varied accordingly, and it's more difficult to obtain definitive valuations. Consumer spending has also reduced, not just because of the restrictions, but as a result of individuals' fears that they may not have sufficient resources long term. Thus, needs have to be reassessed. A final phenomenon emerging from the COVID-19 experience is that people may need to, and do, draw income from their pension schemes far earlier than expected to plug shortfalls of income. They can only do this if they're of a certain age, currently 55 or over, or if they're sick and the scheme formats actually permit this. This isn't, of course, of any immediate benefit to people who are younger. Taking everything together, we must now consider that reports obtained before the onset of the COVID-19 experience and not yet acting on may be less relevant as a guide to the future.
Well, thank you, Nigel. And just thinking about pensions more generally, could you explain to us what the different sorts of pensions there are?
Okay. One encounters two principal types of pension schemes called respectively defined benefit pension schemes and money purchase schemes, which have an alias, defined contribution benefit scheme. I'll start with defined benefit schemes because they're much more complex. These schemes provide guaranteed benefits to people in accordance with a defined formula, usually but not always related to service and remuneration history with a particular employer. The vast majority of people who will henceforth accrue further benefits from such schemes will only be employees in the public sector. Most private sector employers have discontinued the provision of new benefits from such schemes. There are, however, a residual large number of historic schemes closed to new members and closed to future benefit accrual, which do provide benefits to current pensioners and deferred pensioners. Outside the public sector, these schemes will diminish in importance over time. As a result of government legislation and European Courts of Justice judgments, unanticipated longevity and reduced investment returns, these defined benefit schemes are far more expensive than the providers ever intended and are becoming increasingly unaffordable. The guarantees such schemes provide are highly valuable if they're actually delivered, but the inflexibility of the benefits can make them unfit for members' purposes. The income flow can't be varied once commenced. If you've started, you can't stop. They are thus unsuited to provide bridging income when employment ceases temporarily or delivering the extra resources needed for care towards the end of life. Notionally, the risks of defined benefit schemes are borne entirely by the employers, provided these employers survive. Schemes provided by the government are fine. They are unfunded and pensions are paid for out of the general burden of taxation and national insurance on an annual basis. But as a result, such schemes provide no transfer payments. In the private sector, benefits are delivered through funds accumulated from contributions and investments made over the years. These need to be topped up if deficits emerge, say where people live longer than expected, or assets don't perform as hoped for. The employers sponsoring such schemes risk having to make such top-ups. Members' entitlements are in peril if the employer actually fails. There is a lifeboat called the Pension Protection Fund, which is resourced by all the other defined benefit pension schemes, and incidentally not by the government. But this lifeboat doesn't cover all the liabilities of the schemes it has to rescue. As a result of the aftermath of COVID-19, it's now much less certain that a private sector defined benefit scheme will deliver what it has promised. And we believe that divorce practitioners and experts must now take this factor into account. Because of the size of its debt to its pension scheme, British Airways has long been described as a pension fund with wings. And I would make the point that British Airways isn't flying very much at the moment. Defined benefit schemes in the public sector will not provide transfer payments. Therefore, on divorce, it must be recognised that practically these can only be dealt with either by way of offsetting them against other asset types, or alternatively by the spouse of a member with such rights accepting that they will receive a package of benefits in similar formats to their departing spouse, equally inflexible and equally non-transferable. I turn now to money purchase pension schemes, which are becoming the model, the most typical form of pension payment in the UK. Most British workers' pension rights going forward will accrue on this basis. So practitioners should learn that most pension rights for clients working in the private sector will present in this format. Employers in the private sector who may come and go can't responsibly offer any other type of pension arrangement. Money purchase schemes are those where the only guarantee is on what is paid into the scheme from time to time. What emerges from such schemes is not guaranteed, and they are therefore much closer inherently in nature to other asset types such as ISAs and other savings than are defined benefit schemes. And in my view, money purchase schemes should be dealt very similarly with on divorce to other types of savings. It's notable that the second tier auto enrolment scheme instituted by government years ago, pension arrangements for employees are arranged in the money purchase mode. Incidentally, relatively substantial funds are now starting to accumulate in the auto-enrolled schemes, and all advisors should ensure that they know what auto-enrollment rights have been accumulated. The risks of money purchase schemes fall entirely on the member. The principal risks are on investment performance throughout the life of the scheme, and also as a result of longevity improvement. Anyone who either has such a scheme or receives such an entitlement following divorce needs education on how to cope with the risks. On the other hand, under the Flexi Access drawdown regime introduced from 6th of April 2015, these schemes may be drawn on in whole or in part at any time, with a quarter being drawn tax-free and the balance being paid out in a lump sum or in series as taxable income. Therefore, they are very useful, more useful in defined benefit schemes, in providing a source of income to bridge shortfalls in employment from time to time, or alternatively providing higher levels of income later on in life when one needs it, and also finally as a resource which can be passed on to selected beneficiaries, not necessarily restricted to a spouse in the event of death. These resources can be used throughout life, and non-pensioning assets as well can be used to provide pension income. And the similarity between non-pension assets in liquid form and money purchase schemes cannot be overemphasized. I'd like to add a new working definition of a pension. A pension could be redefined on a practical basis as a variable income used to support lifestyle whenever working income dries up or reduces from time to time. Such pensions can be delivered by both money purchase pension schemes and non-pension assets, but not so easily through defined benefit schemes.
Thank you, Nigel. It's great to hear a new working definition of pensions. Just with regard to those pensions, how do we value them, or what is their value? How would you define it? Okay,
the true value of money purchase pension rights is generally the value shown, or the CETV. Although the same amounts of capital, it must be realised, will provide different net payments to different people, depending on individuals' location and tax rates. Money purchase pension schemes are therefore not dissimilar in nature to other assets, save that they can only be accessed from middle life and that they have a separate tax regime. In my view, their treatment on divorce should thus be similar to other asset types. Defined benefit schemes are different. Any transfer values available from private sector defined benefit schemes are usually far less in value than the cost of replicating the original scheme benefits from an annuity policy. It should also be noted that reserves held within a defined benefit scheme are often less than the values required for annuity purchase of similar benefits with an insurer. And many of these schemes these days don't have the necessary level of funding to cover even their own nominal reserves. The ability of an employer to cover the appropriate level of funding should be taken into account when assessing the value of defined benefit rights presented on divorce. Some schemes may offer reduced transfer values to take account of asset falls, and it should be looked for that in these cases, an option to remain within the scheme should be available for a divorced spouse who would otherwise receive a transfer payment pending restoration of reserves. Finally, it should be recognised that in cases of serious ill health and defined benefit schemes, the value of the direct scheme benefits may be less to a member than the transfer value actually offered in some cases. In others, the transfer value may be reduced on account of the sickness and therefore offer less prospects to the member's departing spouse.
And what are the alternative methods of pension division?
Okay, as you know, in all cases, pensions have to be taken into account that reflects principles of fairness and justice. But I'd also add a third principle, utility. It's interesting to note that this third principle, what each party really wants, is not alluded to in the PAG report. In many cases, splitting pension resources on the basis of notional equal pension streams may lead to injustice and ignore utility. In my view, first and foremost, net of tax rather than gross benefits should in any event be the basis of consideration. Further, it must be accepted that the use of unisex annuity rates, which are the only rates offered now by insurers, in achieving equality, is not necessarily fair. If this method is used, then there's likely to be a flaw in what is distributed. The individual worth of benefits calculated by such rates is likely to be unfair in predicting what is actually paid to individual males and females where benefits are transferred to and retained in money purchase pension schemes. Dividing pensions on a resultant income approach can only really be justified in A, cases where both parties will receive defined benefits after pension sharing, in defined pension schemes where the C transfer values as highlighted as not representing the true worth of benefits, or finally, in needs cases where it is necessary to ascertain what income will be produced. Otherwise, there's no reason why this approach should be utilised in dividing money purchase benefits as opposed to the division of any other assets such as ISAs and other savings.
And one of the things which comes out of the PAG report is the importance of experts, pension on divorce experts in particular. Could you explain what you think their role is?
Okay, well, first, the executive summary to the PAG report says the role of the pensions on divorce expert is to provide valuations and expert opinions that will assess the parties and the court in the discretionary exercise. This is, in my view, wrong. The pensions on divorce expert doesn't provide valuations. He or she obtains them and then comments on their shortfalls, the basis of the valuations, and alternatives, and how the values derived could be reapplied or otherwise taken into account. Therefore, in one sense, the role of the pensions on divorce expert is to be a waiter, recounting what's on the menu, rather than as a chef. Particularly in sharing cases where more than core resources are available, you need to ensure that a single expert will provide a full enough menu. His or her terms of engagement should thus be drawn sufficiently widely depending on the circumstances. It should also be acknowledged that a single expert, possibly unchecked, can make mistakes. It's interesting in the WVH case that Judge Hess himself rightly questioned one challenged figure in the expert's report, which didn't seem to make sense. We have on occasion been invited in to provide supplementary reports where this feature has occurred.
Thank you, Nigel. It's interesting you mentioned the case of WNH, which of course we'll be talking about again in a few moments. But just for you, finally, at what point do you think it's important to bring on an expert?
Clients and practitioners will need to assess the available menu of choice regarding pensions assets. Therefore, in my view, a financial advisor should be consulted early in sharing cases and where more resources are available, unless the pensions assets are very simple and the party is well informed. This stage should follow the discovery of what assets are available, but before a pension on divorce expert is appointed. The client's utility for any particular asset class must be taken into account from the early stage and not just following the production of an expert's report. The expert's report should only be commissioned after such consultation and its scope defined to ensure that all the right questions are answered.
Nigel, thank you very much for that. That's brilliant.
Well, thanks to you both very much. That was very informative and obviously a lot of detail there for us to digest. I want to turn to you now, James. We don't often get reported cases involving pensions, but we've had one or two this year, I know. And you're just going to give us a quick update on those.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. So just to reiterate what we've been talking about so far, there's a new report out. It's the PAG report. Well, I say it's new. It came out last year in July, but it's a very significant report. It's the first guidance we have on pension sharing orders and how to share pensions on divorce. And it's from the pension advisory group. So that's how we get to PAG. And the first substantial treatment of it is in the case of W and H. Now, this case is quite important, I would suggest, for three reasons. The first is the judge in the case was His Honour Judge Hess. Significantly, he was one of the co-chairs of the pension advisory group, so he's a real expert when it comes to pensions. The second point is that this case, WNH, was a needs case, and so much of the case law that we see is our sharing cases, but this is a needs case. So it's really important to see one of those cases. And thirdly, in terms of pensions feature very prominently within this case. So that's the third reason why this is such an important case in this area. The facts of the case can be stated quite simply. As I said, it's a needs case. The parties were both about age 50. There were 3 children, the youngest 10, and there were 2 significant assets. There was a former matrimonial home and, much more significantly, pension assets, which were worth over £2.3 million. And those pensions include defined benefit pensions and defined contribution. Now, what Judge Hess does in this case is he looks at three questions and he provides guidance in how to deal with those three. The first is, when you're dividing a pension, should you be trying to equalize capital or equalize income? Secondly, what do you do with non-matrimonial assets, which is otherwise known as ring fencing or apportionment? And thirdly, what do you do about offsetting? That's where you trade one asset for another. And the guidance and the views which are expressed in the report, in that the judgment can be stated quite simply. First, in terms of equalizing capital and income, while in some cases it may be appropriate to try and equalize capital, the starting point will usually be to try and equalize income. And that, to be honest, seems quite straightforward, because what you really want to know about a pension is not how much money is in the pension, it's how much is it going to be paying out at the end of your working life. The second point about non-matrimonial assets. The case law is replete with cases which deal with non-matrimonial assets, but frankly, this simply reflects the fact that so many of the cases that are reported are sharing cases. In W&H, it simply reiterates what is already well known. In needs cases, non-matrimonial assets are less important, by which I mean they shouldn't be excluded, they should be taken into account. And we shouldn't be having all these arguments about whether non-matrimonial assets ought to be excluded. And thirdly, on offsetting, there is, the case is very cautious about offsetting. It says you should be very careful before you consider it. And the reason is that when you're comparing pensions, the figure you normally get is, or the valuation you normally get, the cash equivalent transfer value, you should be very careful when you're just looking at that and comparing it with equity, say equity in a former matrimonial house. They are different things. And if you're just comparing them, the figures, it's likely to lead to unfairness. And so if you're going to do offsetting, and sometimes you will have to offset, you really ought to be getting expert advice. And that leads me to the two other points which I think arise from this case of W and H. The first is the role of experts. Nigel has already talked about that, but just to reiterate their importance, the PAG report has a template letter for experts. It's at Appendix E. It's really worth reading if you need to talk about, if you need to get experts instruction. But what the report says, the PAG report, is that if you have assets, pension assets of over about £100,000, so not an awful lot of money in a pension, you really ought to be considering getting an expert report. Now, I do have to note there is a tension there about getting expert evidence where there might not be a lot of money, where your client may not have a lot of money, but nonetheless, the PAG report is quite clear. You really should be considering it if pension assets are over £100,000, and you should certainly be considering it if offsetting is a possibility. And the other thing that arises out of the judgment of W&H is the importance of the PAG report itself. So Andrew McFarlane, the president of the Family Division, did the foreword to the PAG report. And he was very clear in that, in saying that the PAG report is formal guidance to be applied when any issue regarding a pension falls to be determined in financial remedy proceedings. And that is why it was referred to so much within the case of W and H. And just building on that, there are two other cases which have turned up on Bailey, which deal with pensions on divorce. They're both from His Honour Judge Richard Robinson, who sits in Medway. The first case, and it's instructed to look at them in conjunction with W&H, even though they were decided independently of it. The first is the case of KM and CV, and you'll see them on the recent cases on Bailey. That judgment was delivered the day after W&H, so it doesn't make reference to it, but interestingly, the conclusions of the judge are very similar to, or comparable with, what Judge Hess found in W&H. First, Judge Robinson emphasised the importance of the PAG report itself. He referred to it, he quoted from it with approval within the judgment, and he adopted the recommendations, the guidance that had been given in the PAG report. Secondly, he emphasised the importance of experts again, and it's really important actually in this case, the case of KM and CV, because unlike the case of W&H, the pension assets were only worth £130,000, so only 5% of the value of the pensions in W&H. Nonetheless, Judge Robinson said a pension expert should have been instructed in this case. And that does, as I said, that does lead to that tension. The case of KM and CV is a case where there was very little money indeed, but nonetheless, the judge was saying there really ought to have been an expert. And the third thing he says in that case is that, again, there should be no ring fencing of non-matrimonial assets. There is then another case, also from Judge Robinson, which he gave a couple of weeks later, called RH&SV. And once again, I've already said it. He emphasises the importance of PAG. He also again reiterates there should not be ring fencing in these cases. But one final point, which is important in the case of RH&SV, in that case, there was an agreement between the parties to exclude non-matrimonial assets, namely with regard to the pension. But the judge says, and it was an appeal case, we said the district judge in that particular case should still have applied PAG. He should have ignored the agreement between the parties. And so just reiterating the importance of what the PAG report says and the guidance it gives on these points. So what Judge Robinson is saying is that you should be reading and following the PAG report. Well, thank you, Jeremy.
Oh, thanks so much, James. I see that we've got some questions now, so I think we'll just have a few questions just to wrap things up. And I think we're joined by Nigel. Yes, I can see you. And the first question that we've got from one of our attendees is there any merit, and I'll ask this of you first of all, Nigel, is there any merit to delaying having a pension sharing report commissioned during the current pandemic?
I don't think there's any reason for not going ahead with it. There's going to be normal volatility in any event, but everybody should realise that values get reassessed at the actual point of division. So there's an inherent problem with all sharing of pension resources that they get reassessed in the future. So I don't see now, when markets have stabilised a bit, why you shouldn't go straight ahead and commission the report.
I suppose there's a more nuanced difficulty, which I suspect some of us are wrestling with at the moment, which is that we already have a report that might have been dated either at the beginning of the pandemic or before, and we're sort of wondering, you know, what to do about that. Do we go back and get an updated? Do we go back and get an updated value? You got any?
I think the answer's on the case-by-case basis. You can't give a general global solution. I think if you've come to a division which says you get X% and somebody else gets 100 minus X%, then if it's in a defined benefits scheme, you can rely on what you've got.
Yeah.
I also would make the point that splitting assets generally, you have to look at the relative size of pensions to other assets. And if the pension fund was, say, the major asset, was the only thing the couple had, and if it was a money purchase scheme, well, if you've got a proportion division, then you simply get a proportion of what's there,
Sure.
same as you were splitting an ISA. It depends on the circumstances, the size of other assets, but if there's a mixture and the relative importance of one asset has changed, then you may need to commission a new report.
Have you got anything to add to that, James? Just in terms of the decision, you know, and our role in that, I suppose, as lawyers. Well,
yeah, I mean, the point about whether you commission a report, whether you commission an updating report, that's a decision that you as the lawyer have that's a call you have to make. And you really have to reflect, and it's just the factors actually that Nigel has just listed. How important is the pension relative to the other assets? If the pensions is only a minor asset, you probably don't need an updating report because the amount of monetary change may be relatively minor. And in fact, it may be dwarfed by the cost of getting the updating report in any event. But you also have to look, even if pensions are significant, you also have to look at the pensions themselves, because some pensions are going to have changed a lot more than others. If you've got a defined benefit pension, which is a public sector one, it's going to still get funded out by taxpayers. So you probably don't need an updating report in that circumstance, but it's really something you're going to have to consider yourself on a case-by-case basis. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, here's another one. You mentioned this in your talk, actually, Nigel, that when pension funds get into difficulty, and they're not all they crack up to be, which is yet another worrying feature that will keep us up at night, I'm sure. But we have a question. If my client is aware that their pension scheme may well be going into the Pension Protection Fund, how should sharing be approached? If I could direct that at you, Nigel.
Okay. Firstly, I'll revert to something I said during my talk, that people are treated differently within the pensions lifeboat. Generally speaking, people who are in receipt of a pension and are past normal retirement age keep what they've got within the lifeboat. But say if somebody retired early, and say if somebody would be on a pension of £100,000 a year, aged 59, the move to the lifeboat could suddenly change his pension so that he would get the maximum that is permitted to below age pensioners of £25,000. So the first point I'm making is that everybody, where there is, I think, number one, people should check the state of funding of their defined benefit scheme. That's the first important point. And I think that's now incumbent on all advising practitioners. Then look at the likelihood of there being a reduction. And thirdly, one will have to take it in the context again of the interrelation with other assets. Is one party going to keep the whole asset? Is it going to be split? If it's the only asset, then whatever comes will come and the split is fair. You've got to deal it individually. My point is that you've got to check out the funding of the pension scheme and the proximity to the lifeboat, because you can get dramatic changes.
Okay, we've got, thanks Nigel. We've got a question from Julie. She asks, I've recently had a report returned after requesting equality of income where the parties were aged 61 and 69. It factored in the state pension for the 61-year-old, which could not be taken until 67. And she wonders, any clues as to why that would be? I don't know whether you can comment on that, Nigel, or not.
The state pension commencement date is being increasingly deferred because guaranteed benefits across the whole spectrum can't be financed by all parties, including government. What actuaries do, what pensions experts do, is look at the available income streams that are available from all sources, and when they start, they then convert it to a value and an equivalent income starting at a commonly agreed date. You may, depending on their instructions, what the instruction might be is so that each party gets the same income from when they attain age 75 or 65. Alternatively, if they're of the right age, what value would give them the same worth starting today? So that's how it works. But it depends on the instructions.
Sure.
Often we produce reports showing options so that to inform the court, to inform the parties.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Here's another question we have quickly. Should a party's health status be taken into account in a pension sharing report? And if so, when would this be appropriate? Interesting question.
The answer is it should be considered. Some pension schemes give, in money purchase cases, it doesn't matter too much, but that emphasizes the need to consider division on the value of the assets and not on an income basis, on a capital rather than an income basis. In a defined benefit scheme, there are two situations. Number one, the defined benefit scheme may offer the same transfer value come what may, regardless of somebody's health. And therefore, the parties concerned get a higher value, actually, by taking the transfer if somebody's really sick and won't live to receive the pension. Corresponding, there are other schemes that say if somebody's dead sick, we reduce the value, and therefore most people, both parties can get affected as a result of that. You've got to look at it case by case, check the basis on which the transfer values are offered, and also check who is likely to get what as a result of the splitting of pension resources.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much. I think we're going to wrap it up now, but thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm going to pass over to you now, James, just to sign off. Thanks very much to everyone.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Jeremy, for chairing. Thank you, Nigel, for joining us today and giving us all that your expertise in this area. This talk is going to be put on YouTube, so if you want to watch it again, please do look at it there. And finally, I should just note, this is a part of a seminar series. The next seminar is going to be on the 7th of July with Gemma Barrington and Alison Pryor, and a talk entitled Applying Criminal Law and Procedure to Police Evidence in Care Cases. So please do join us again for that. Thank you very much.